let's jump in here because it's 11 o'clock, or my time, 12 o'clock Eastern. My name is Chris Morton, and I'm here to help moderate our call today. The name of this webinar is How to Develop Pioneers Who Start Fresh Expressions of Church. I'm joined by Gannon Sims and Dave Mail. As we go, if you guys want to just ask questions in the chat box on the website, and we'll have an opportunity here near the end to do that. You can also ask us on Twitter at FExpressionsUS. So it's at FExpressionsUS. And we'll see that on Twitter as well. So I'm going to turn things over to Gannon and be back with you guys when we get to our questions here in a few moments.
Well, bringing greetings from the U.S. Fresh Expressions team in the name of the author and pioneer of our faith, our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. That is the reason why we gather. And we're joined today, of course, by Dave Mail. Dave has been a pioneer in ministry for over 20 years. He planted a church, a fresh expression of church, before anybody coined that phrase. And Dave, for the last 8 years, has been training pioneer ordinands, seminarians at Ridley Hall, Cambridge. And Dave is going to share a little bit with us about the importance of developing, training, finding, releasing pioneers, and he's going to share a little bit of his own story. Now, before we get started, I will plug Dave's book. It's called The Word is Out. Hopefully Dave can tell us how we can get a hold of the book. And throughout the call, we'll talk a little bit at the end of the call about ways that you can get involved. So we have a pioneer learning community beginning at the end of February, and participants on the call will receive $5 off the entry fee for that, for your participation today, so we're pleased to offer that. But I'm going to turn it over to Dave. He'll share with us for about 15-20 minutes, and then we'll open it up to your questions. If you'll type your questions in the boxes Chris suggested, but also let us know who you are, where you're from, how you're connected, so that we can really know. We got people on the call from California and even in Australia, so we're pleased that we can present this sort of global view of Fresh Expressions of Church. Dave?
Yeah, well, great, and thank you for that, Gannon. Great to be with you. I'm here in cold Cambridge today, and it is great to be with you. There is, I think, in the UK, a quiet revolution going on. I am part of a sleepy part of the Church of England here around Cambridge, and we've just done some research over the last 10 years to discover that over 50 new Christian communities have begun in this small area, just in the Church of England. That's out of 300 existing churches. So we're looking at 1 in 6 new churches in the last 10 years here. And what is also interesting out of that is that of those leaders, over half of them are lay leaders. And in fact, over half of those have never had any kind of training. And so what we're seeing is a whole revolution of lots and lots of small new communities growing out of established churches, but with a real desire to reach people outside the church. And I think the most exciting thing about this revolution is that the research is telling us that 75% of people joining these new forms of church are from outside church. We've never ever in any of our missionary work seen statistics like that. In general, it's kind of around 5 to 10% with kind of classic church planting. But here we're seeing 75% of people joining these communities are from outside church. But I think my passion and desire is for those people who are leading these kind of churches, and with a real desire to see more and more. Again, in the Church of England, we have 180 ordained pioneers that have begun. But we're very aware that to really connect with the majority of people in our country, we don't need 180, we need thousands. And so part of my story is how do we find those people, release them, enable them, support them, and equip them to do the work that God is calling them, and in a way not to get in the way as well, to allow them to do what they want to do. One of the things I'm always saying to people is I don't think this is complicated. I really don't. I think one of the problems is you can read some books and it sounds massively complicated, and there are pages of diagrams and everything else. I think that there are 3 simple questions that we need to ask when we begin something new. Who are we? What do we know? And who do we know? I think those are the simple questions that need to be asked. So, who are you? You know, you might be an ordained person, but you might be a doctor or a factory worker or whatever. What do you know? What is it that you know that might have an impact in terms of the gospel? So, who might be the people that you know, and what is happening in their lives and their communities? And who of those people do you know that you could begin and to develop or build relationships with, out of which some kind of new form of Christian community might grow? And I suppose that sums up my story, really. I think at the heart of most pioneers is a desire for people outside the church. And that's very much at the heart of that. And I think for me that's formed by the fact that I really became a Christian from outside the church. And one of the questions I've often asked myself is, if those people hadn't come to where I lived to tell me about Jesus, what would have happened to me? And that kind of passion, I think, has driven me. That, in a sense, is who I am. And after I got ordained, I suppose the thing that I began to know is that actually the churches I was involved with, good as they were not conducive to people from outside the church. They were great for people in the church, fed them, encouraged them, developed them, but they weren't places where people who were wanting to explore faith and find Jesus could really do that. And who did I know? Well, my wife and I have always known more people outside the church than in the church, and it was from our conversations with them that we could have great conversations, but the people would say to us, we don't want to go to kind of church. And so probably in the 1990s, a small group of us began to kind of dream about what could we do. We began 1 or 2 experiments, and we came to the realization of what would it look like to begin to create a church for people outside the church. And that began us on this kind of adventure. So there was about 20 of us who just began dreaming and thinking, what could we do to enable this to happen? And somehow we managed to persuade the Church of England Diocese to back us for 3 years to do this. And I think one of the things that really strikes me about pioneers is that they love firsts. They love blank sheets. They don't want to just copy what other people have done, but in terms of their context, they want to do something new. It doesn't mean it's the first time it's ever been done, but it means it's the first time in that particular context. And so we were really excited as well as scared about this kind of blank sheet of how do we begin to create church for these people. And I think what we found is what has been now found more and more in the UK, that there is a process that goes on about listening to God and listening to the people. And we got some of our unchurched friends together to ask them, what would you like a kind of a community centered around Jesus to be like? We listened to God. We spent 5-6 months praying together, reading scripture together, saying what is it that God is calling us to do, because ultimately this is his work, not ours, and we're trying to find out where he's leading us. And then out of that was kind of beginning to develop relationships that we already had in the locality, to begin to build community, and then explore what with these people we were developing our relationships with, what following Jesus might look like for them. And we found pretty quickly that people really wanted to find out about what this looked like. And in fact, we'd started off thinking, well, the stuff that we do, which is more worship focused, they're just not going to come to. But very quickly, they started coming to that. And we found we had to change that to make it appropriate for them. We didn't want to water down the message, but we were saying what is appropriate to help these people find Jesus and then grow in him. We found lots of ways of beginning to do that, and the use of small groups and other things. But I think probably at the heart of what we were doing was not trying lots of new things, but just keeping at the forefront that this church is for people who are outside the church. That I discovered was my main role in leading this. That actually that had to govern everything else that we were doing, and was the focus. So every activity we were going to do, everything we were going to do with children, youth, small groups, groups outside, the focus was how will this enable people outside of the church to come to know Jesus. That was our driving passion, vision, guided everything else that we did. And we found that that's what happened. That actually, though people are turned off church, there is a real spiritual hunger that's still out there. People are still asking the same questions about what's life about, but they just don't think the church has any answers to those questions. But then gradually, as that grew and developed, my kind of question that came out of that was, well, what about leaders of these kind of things? We were finding more and more churches like we'd started in Huddersfield in Northern England starting, and I grew more and more concerned and with a passion for those leaders to equip them and enable them and help them, and began to network with them. And I think that's probably one of the biggest lessons that we found, the importance of bringing those kinds of people together. Often, I think pioneers by their nature feel quite isolated, and to bring them together where, this is the thing we often say, that you don't have to explain who you are. I think quite often pioneers find that they're always having to explain what they're doing and why they're doing different things and in different ways. And it's just fantastic to be with other pioneers, not to have to explain yourself, but where you can find support, encouragement, prayer, and people who just want to be with you and help you and encourage you. So out of that, I came here to Cambridge and began the whole process of helping to train pioneers who were ordained in the Church of England. But over the last few years, that's really grown and developed, so that we're doing as much as with lay people as we are with ordained, with this real passion to reach people in our country, and a real passion to find more and more of these kind of people. I think one of the things that we've been discovering is that there isn't one type of pioneer as well. I think one of the problems can be, oh, pioneers are like this, you know, they're extroverts, or they're upfront people, or they're young people, or that whatever. And actually, what we're finding in the UK is that there isn't one type of pioneer. They're young people, they're old people, they're introverts, they're extroverts, they're upfront people, they're behind-the-scenes people. But they often share some characteristics. One of them is what I call this thing of firsts, that they love first. The second is that they tend to be people who are very happy on the edge of church, who are kind of bilingual, so they're very happy in the world outside the church, but they also can operate in the church. They are driven by a real passion for those outside the church and how they may discover Jesus for themselves. They're risk takers. They love a risk. And I think one of the things I'm finding more and more with pioneers, and this is true for myself, is we're the kind of people who say, well, let's try it. If it doesn't work, it doesn't matter. We'll try something else. They're not scared of failure. Failure is just one step to actually discovering what God wants. Another thing I'm finding more and more with pioneers is that they are great dissenters, and by that I mean they are people who are always proposing an alternative. So they're classically people who say, well, why do we always do it this way? What about doing it this way? So it can feel, I think, in church life sometimes that pioneers are just pains because they're always questioning things and asking things and saying, why do we do it this way? But actually, I think that's a really key thing. And then the other thing I think with pioneers is that in the New Testament and the Old Testament, you see two movements. You see a kind of the movement in to gather, and you see the movement out in terms of scattering and mission. And both are vital. So you have people we are called disciples, but also apostles, as the one who was sent. And I think in general, pioneers are always thinking about moving out. They love gathering together, but they're always gathering, thinking, where might we go next with this gathering? Where might some of us go next in developing another new community and another new community? What might be some of the firsts around this whole thing? And I think for me, we've had big debates in this country about whether the word pioneer is a good word, and I don't know quite how it operates in an American system. But one of the reasons I like it is that it's actually a biblical word, and it appears 4 times in the New Testament, every time linked to Jesus, that Jesus is our ultimate pioneer. And the word has that sense of someone who leads or provides the way or provides the first in any occasion. And obviously with Jesus, it's very much about salvation. He is the one that provides and leads and is first in terms of our salvation. And I think it's a really good reminder that actually the only reason we can pioneer is that Jesus has already pioneered for us. And that is at the heart, in the sense of who we are. We are people who have been saved by Jesus' incarnation, his death and resurrection, and the coming of the Spirit. And actually our pioneering is a response to his pioneering work. And he then calls us to pioneer with him and for him. And for me, that has been really important in seeing that actually, quite often we think about Paul as the archetype pioneer, but actually in Scripture, the archetype pioneer for us is Jesus. And the other thing I think that comes out from particularly where it's used in Hebrews is the sense that that his pioneering work is costly. And I think it reminds us that actually pioneering work is costly. It's not always easy. It's not always glamorous. It is hard at times, and it costs us. But actually, as the writer to the Hebrews reminds us, we look to Jesus, who has completed this work despite the cost. And that is our incentive to keep going on. And I think there is something about pioneers who are just robust characters. You know, we're not put off by the first bit of problems, but we're willing to kind of keep going, to keep developing what we're doing, to keep trusting that God is in this whole thing. And we're seeing this more and more and more. So let me give you an example as we kind of as I draw to a close on this bit. Those 3 simple things: who are you, what do you know, who do you know? Here in Cambridge, when I first came here 8 years ago, I met someone, and who was she? She was a mum at a local school in one of the tougher areas of Cambridge. And she was meeting with 1 or 2 other mums who were Christians who were linked into the school, and they were praying for the school. But then they felt God saying to them, actually it wasn't enough to pray, that they needed to do something about it. So they began to pray what they should do. And so they asked that question, well, what do we know? And the answer was that we know a lot of, particularly the mums who they know, were very isolated. A number of them were struggling with alcohol issues and drug issues, were needing help, were seeking help. And who did they know? Well, they knew a lot of them through the playground. So they began to gather on a Friday morning with these people and invite them to come with them. They would have coffee and something to eat. There would be a chance to watch a DVD and to discuss it. They would offer prayer, but a lot of it was just support and friendship. And over 3 or 4 years, they saw a significant number of those people become followers of Jesus. And just recently, in fact, they've had some baptisms. But what is amazing, and this is, I think, the thing I've recently discovered about pioneering, is that often when Jesus opens up one area, actually opens up other areas. So you begin something thinking we're pioneering this, and then actually you find we're now pioneering this as well. So what happened was that it was mostly mums, because the time of day they met, said, this is fantastic, but what about our partners? What about our children? They can't come on a Friday morning, and it's more kind of related to us as mums. So they began about a year ago something on a Saturday, which is now much more open to partners and to children. And they have about 60 to 80 people coming along to this second fresh expression of church. And that's the kind of exciting thing I see just happening over and over again, from those simple questions, really, of who are you, what do you know, and who do you know. It's not difficult, but it's difficult in the sense of actually trusting God will be in it, sticking with it, and seeing actually God at work sometimes in the most amazing ways. But that probably is enough for me at the moment. Gannon, I'll hand back to you, and maybe we can have a bit of talking with some of the people who are listening.
So, if there may already be questions in the queue, Chris Morton's going to join us again, and there is a slight delay when a question is typed. I think there's a little bit of delay, so we'll be.
Okay.
But Chris, if you're about this question yet.
Hi, yeah. Well, we have one question so far, so go ahead and start asking your questions. You can just type them in the chat box. The first question, either of you who want to take this, if you want to tell us a little bit more about this idea of Jesus as pioneer, what you mean when you say that, where you find that in Scripture, and why that is useful to you.
Yep. Well, the Greek word is archegos, from which has the first part of that is actually the word that means first or beginning, as in John 1, in the beginning. It's that exact word, and it's sometimes translated as pioneer. It's sometimes translated as leader. It's used twice by Luke in Acts. And it's used twice in Hebrews. Hebrews 12:1 is probably the most well-known, and I think, from memory, Hebrews 2:10 is the other time. And as I said, it's very much the sense that Jesus, through his death and resurrection, is the pioneer of our salvation. He has led the way. He is the one who's first. So everything we do follows his leading. He is in a sense, the writer in Hebrews is saying, he's opened the way for us. He's done it. It's not anything we have to do. But I think it gives us a pattern for our pioneering, which is then, in a sense, in response to Jesus's pioneering. That would be my answer to that. I don't know if you've got anything to add to that, Gannon.
No, I think that's the reason why we began at talking about Jesus, the author and pioneer of our faith. Because that's where we want to be. I mean, we don't want these things to be around a cult of personality. We want them to be centered on the risen Christ.
And I'll just add, hopefully you can see that, but I've written this booklet which deals with some of this, called Pioneering Leadership, which you can get from Grove Books in the UK. If you Google or use any other type of search engine and put in Grove Books UK, you'll get this, and you can download it. I think it's cheap. It's $5 or something like that, and you can download it from there. It's under, if you go to the leadership section there, and it's called Pioneering Leadership: Disturbing the Status Quo. And I look at this whole thing of Jesus as pioneer, but also some of the characteristics of pioneering as well.
Great. Anything to add?
Well, are there any other questions?
Yeah, okay, so our next question is, how do you train pioneers, or do you train them? And I'll just add, maybe if you want to take a step back before that, I would guess there's probably an identification that has to be done even before that.
Yep. I think that the best way to identify pioneers is to find people who've been pioneering. I know it sounds crazy, but that is the simplest way. So if someone comes to see me, as often happens, and they'll sit here and they'll say, I'm wondering whether I'm a pioneer. They may be thinking about full-time. It may be, you know, in their spare time, as it were. The first question I'll ask them is, tell me about something that you've started from scratch. It doesn't have to be church-related. It might be at school, at college, in your social life, in your house. And if they say to me, I've never ever started anything from scratch, then I'd begin to have some questions as to whether they are pioneering. Because my feeling generally is that pioneers are born, not made. So that would be the kind of thing I'm looking for. And I think in the New Testament that seems to be the pattern, that people were identified because of what they'd already been doing, rather than trying to kind of come up with some tests for that. So that would be my, where are these kind of, and often my experience certainly was that they're not always people at the center of the church, because often because of their passion for those outside the church, but their kind of frustration with church, they're often on the edge of church. They're not always the central people. The second thing I think I'd say is a great question. It's something I've kind of pondered myself. I don't think you can train pioneers, but what you can do is create an environment in which they'll flourish. I think that's the key thing for me. So for me, the key things in terms of working with pioneers is really enabling to meet with other pioneers, exposing them to new people and new ideas, not so they'll just copy them, but so that they see, wow, there are bigger horizons than I'd ever realized out there. And then there are, yeah, of course, there are some skills that you can put into them, or you can help to develop in terms of understanding of what might be the processes that we're learning about the best way to form new communities around Christ, that kind of thing. So there are some skills, but I think for me the skills bit is probably down the line from the need to come together and the exposure to new people, new ideas. When I think about my own pioneering here in the UK, the thing that most impacted me was hearing other people who were doing pioneering stuff. And it just making me think, cool, there are possibilities that I've not dreamt of before, and I can do something with that. So, I mean, over here we use the Mission Shape Ministry MSM course a lot, and I run the local one here across this region, and we've had 200 pioneers go through that, mostly lay, some people who are full-time church workers, but mostly lay people who are doing that over a year. And again, I think the key thing for that is those people coming together, and it's meeting people who are leading it and who are talking about their pioneering, and then, yeah, there are some really important skills that they're learning to help them kind of really hone that thing. But for me, it's the environment and create an environment in which pioneers can flourish. I think the other thing when I'm working here with ordained people is how do you keep them dangerous? Because the danger is that when you put pioneers in an institution, it doesn't mix well. And I think one of the things that institutions have to ask, whatever those look like, how do we keep these people on the edge and dangerous? Because we don't want to just kind of tame them so that actually they end up not wanting to pioneer, but how do we enable them to finish their training that they are even more excited about the pioneering potential than when they started? But yeah, great question, I think, great question.
Anything to add, Gannon?
Now let's hear the next question.
All right. So next up is Ryan from Pittsburgh. If you guys ask a question, be sure to share your name and where you're at. And if you're having trouble with the chat box for any reason, you can also get us on Twitter at FExpressionsUS. You can tweet us at FExpressionsUS. So our next question is from Ryan in Pittsburgh. Ryan asks, how do we remain relevant while trying to reach people in our context and not come across as aggressive? So maybe a few questions in there, but I'll let you parse that out.
No, really, really good questions, Ryan. When we started the net, that was one of our big words. You know, the need to be relevant. I've actually decided that relevant's not a great word, because actually, in some senses, the gospel isn't relevant. It's not. I think a better word than relevant is accessible. I think that for me is the key word. How, because I think the gospel is by its nature countercultural, so we can't always make it seem relevant, but we do it a massive disservice. We do if we don't make him accessible, and I think that's the really key thing for me. How do we make this amazing person, because it is ultimately about Jesus, accessible to people so that they can discover for themselves? And I think that it depends on your context, but for us it meant I think lots of well, my experience has been that people are not worried about you telling them what you think as Christians. I sometimes go to places where basically no one wants to say what a Christian is, or you know what it means to believe in Jesus, because they don't want to put people off. But actually there is a hermeneutic, a suspicion out there. So actually people do want to hear what we believe. But also what they want is the chance to explore, to question around that. So the danger is they feel church is a place where I hear this message, I've either got to accept it there and then, or I leave. And I think it's about building communities that are centered around Jesus, but which allow people to explore, to find out in their own time, in their own ways, and gives them the freedom to ask really difficult questions as they grapple with that. And in a way, that's what you see with Jesus and the disciples and the crowds, you know, the kind of questions they're asking and that whole process, but they're still part of this community. And for me, we discovered that in Huddersfield. How do we build a community that allows people the time to explore and doesn't feel that very quickly you've either got to, you know, do an 8-week course and become a follower, or you leave. So it's about accessibility. It's about the place to explore and ask questions. And I think God then does his own work, really, and it's letting him do that.
The more questions people are able to ask, and the questions that we receive from them, I think there's a space created within that person that just enabled, you know, it settles people down if they have sort of a hard edge to them. When you accept them, accept their questions, enable them to ask the questions, it really is. It builds a bridge.
Yeah.
And I guess it keeps us with them. And makes the gospel accessible. So
yeah, I think the other thing with that is it brings a new freshness to the gospel for us. I found that all the time working with unchurched people. God, I'd never seen it that way. I never thought about it like that way, because we're so used to the stories and what Jesus does. You suddenly think, oh wow, yeah. So I actually think we learn, and our faith is deepened through that process. You know, that we are gospeled by that and are continually gospeled in that as well.
Yeah, they come up with a whole new language.
Yeah.
That's marvelous, yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
Great. Well, our next question is from Twitter, from @PrayingForPastors. So thank you for your prayers.
Thanks.
His or her question is, outside of your typical church building, this is a great question. I need your help with this, Dave. Outside of your typical church building, what type of location do you see most beneficial for the kingdom?
Great question. It's hard to answer because I think it depends on your context. Our research suggests that kind of probably half of these new things are meeting outside church buildings and half are meeting in church buildings. a lot of them are the kind of classic third space of cafes, restaurants, sports centres, what we would call pubs. Can't remember what you call them in America. But it's basically anywhere where I think people feel relaxed that we find works really well. And it also depends. So in very rural places in the UK, the church is the best place because it's probably the only community building that is going. But in towns and cities, there's a whole choice of these kind of third space places which feels often to people, I think, more accessible than church because they know the buildings, they feel home at them. In Huddersfield, we use schools quite often. Found those buildings really good for people. I think you've just got to work out in the context of where you are and what you're doing, what are places that are accessible for people and where they know. I mean, parking's another thing we had to think about when those kind of things as well. I think are really important. I don't know if you've got anything to add to that, Gannon.
No, I'm with you. I minister on a college campus, and we have to find places that are accessible to students, places that are familiar to them. So we'll meet them on campus, and we've got a center that doesn't feel like a church where they're comfortable. We meet them in coffee shops. So certainly places outside. Yeah, I think that the main thing is just the relationships that are built.
Yeah, and I think Jesus showed us the way. Do lots of stuff around food. I mean, that is
absolutely
so important, and we're discovering that more and more. So many of these things gather around food, I think Jesus is, that's just again a great lead for us in how people gather around food and how it actually enables community to really develop. But yeah, great question.
Yeah, we actually got a suggestion from Catherine that laundromats are a great location.
Yep. I think that is. Yep. Cool. And it's interesting that you should say that because the church I was talking about, the End, where they've now developed 2 churches, some of the new people that have come to faith were saying they want to now start something in their laundromat because that's where people gather and they've got the time that they're hanging around. So, yeah, I think that's a brilliant idea.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Great. Okay, our next question comes from, let's see, he's staying anonymous. He or she is staying anonymous, but a pastor in a Baptist church in Virginia. So, Gannon, you may know.
Yeah, so better be careful.
They say, like many churches, budgets are extremely tight. Are there... like many churches, budgets are extremely tight. Are there any resources through Fresh Expressions, US BJV, to help fund Fresh Expressions, or even free or inexpensive resources such as intro Bible study or discipleship materials?
Yes, there are. There are some grants available. There is a subsidy available should you or anyone on the call from various denominational partners be interested in participating in our Pioneer Learning Community, our MSM course. And we are working on developing some resources that can be used in discipleship. So stay tuned for those. We're releasing some videos in a couple of months that will be available online for purchase, just $15, that will help tell the story of Fresh Expressions in a more concrete way. So look for those things. And I mean, I think the brilliant thing about Fresh Expressions is that my former colleague Ben Jameson always used to use the word lightweight and low maintenance. I mean, a lot of these things that we're doing are things that you can do around food. You can do around your kitchen table. You can do in a public space. These are not things that are requiring a fully employed, ordained clergy to lead. And that's when we're talking about releasing people in our churches and our congregations, finding those people on the edges that are a little disquiet, that are a little that have something to say, and continuing to disciple them, to develop them, and to release them into the spheres of their influence, and seeing what they can come up with.
And I think that, to add to that, I completely agree. I mean, our research in the UK has said most starting groups for these kind of things are between 3 to 12 people, so they're not huge things, and the average size is around 45 people. So what we're finding is working is hundreds and hundreds of these small things, rather than as often we've thought, oh, you know, to do this we need, you know, a pastor and a worship leader and a new building and all. Actually, what we're finding is it's just a few people gathering together, asking the kind of questions, you know, who am I, what do I know, who do I know, and doing it. And it doesn't really cost anything often to do it, apart from your whole life, in a sense. But apart from that costliness, resources, probably not a lot.
Great, thank you. That was a really practical question. And I will also say that as far as some discounted resources, today, if you sign up for Pioneer Communities, you get $75 off, which is about 10% of the cost. So 10% off, that's a pretty helpful discount there, $75. And there is a link on the screen right there to do that today. There's also, if you go to freshexpressionsus.org, as well as Dave, what's the UK site? And plug your
freshexpressions.org.uk.
freshexpressions.org.uk. And years of really great resources there on the blogs and videos and whatnot there that you can check out. Okay, next question comes from Veem. And Veem, I believe, is in Hollywood. Veem Haskell. Let's see. Yeah, Hollywood Church of the Nazarene. And what do you say to people who are not pioneers and who actually fear these ventures? That is a great question.
Yeah, it's a great question again. I think that what I tend to say is let them have a go. You know, this is an experiment, so they'll be fine. Just let them do it. And we often use the language in the UK of mixed economy, and by that we mean we're not saying all these new things are going to replace everything that's been before. What we're saying is we need both and. So I would be saying to people, it doesn't mean that we're going to get rid of your 10 o'clock traditional service on a Sunday morning. It's just we're aware that if we're going to reach this whole community, that one way is not the only way to do this. And so we want to try something else alongside that. That would be the way I talk about it. And I mean, theologically, I would talk about diversity and unity. You know, there is one church, but there are lots of ways of being church. And I think that's somehow in the last 100 years we've lost sight of that and thought there was just one way of doing church and it looked like this. And it met in a particular kind of building, a style. And now we've realized actually God works in so many different ways, and we need to, in a sense, represent that in the different ways that we do church. So we're not saying it's the end of tradition. I love there is a New Zealand missiologist who talks about it's not about leaving the tradition, but it's driving to the very heart of it. And I think in all of our traditions, at the heart of it is something about reaching those outside the church with forms of church. And most of our traditions have been involved in changing their traditions over time. And it's going back to this, what is at the heart of what we're about, and what might that look like in our local community?
And I just add to that many pastors feel like they have to be the pioneer when most pastors are not. A pastor can only be so innovative. They've got to rely on the innovation from kind of around the edges of their congregation. So Mike Moyna, who's a researcher with Fresh Expressions UK, really suggests that pastors are the, to use football and American football, and we really need to block and tackle for the pioneers, to train them, to develop them, to pray for them. We need people of prayer in churches to surround these people, and to really send them off as missionaries who are connected to the existing congregation. So I think if there are any pastors feeling like, oh my, if I don't do this, then there's something wrong with me. Really, it's about who are you finding, who are you releasing within your own communities of faith.
Yep, absolutely.
Great, great. Okay, another question here from Jenny in Pittsburgh. Jenny asks, Jenny prefaces by saying, "This is the question I'm going to be asked." So maybe looking for some backup here. Jenny says, "What kind of accountability should pioneers have? How do we keep folks on the edge from falling off of the edge?"
Yeah. Brilliant question, Jenny. This is something we've thought a lot about in the UK, and we believe that accountability is really important. So we're not saying, oh, just let pioneers go off and do their own thing. We're saying all our pioneers have to be accountable to someone or to some people. And I think for me there is a link, there's a dual side of accountability and support. They are the same thing, but they're just two sides of that same thing, of being kind of part of this bigger thing called church with a capital C. And so I think that accountability is really important, that pioneers have someone or a group that they go to that are asking them good questions and sometimes hard questions, but that accountability is done in a supportive way. And I think that is important as well, that it's not kind of, we're here to try and trip you up or make life difficult for you. But actually, part of the support is asking you, some difficult questions. I met with a pioneer this morning, and I asked him, who is accountable to me, and I asked him some difficult questions, and I've set him some kind of things to go away and think about, and he'll come back and talk more about those things. But actually, that we ended with a huge hug, because that's support. Actually, is to be concerned, to want the best. So yeah, no, I totally agree. We really don't. We don't allow pioneers as much as we can here to be unaccountable. That they need to be tied in, to be linked in, to understand that they are part of something bigger than just themselves.
Well, and being willing to support those people. I mean, I think most people feel like, well, pioneers are going to do their own thing and they're going to go off on their own. They're not looking for accountability. But the more we can, as Dave suggested earlier, create a community for them where they can share stories, and really where these prophetic people, a lot of artistic people, where they feel supported by the institution. If you get a pioneer early enough, say in seminary, where a 20-something, a 30-something, you imagine the impact they can make over a 30-year ministry career. They may be a starter, and they may start 30, 40, 100 of these things. So 1 or 2 a year from each denomination, as we patchwork this across the U.S. and really across many countries, you can imagine the renewal that could take place if the appropriate support is allowed.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that I'd say is that my experience is pioneers are not worried about being accountable. They're more worried about being isolated. So they want to be. Yeah. And actually often their complaint to me is no one cares about what I'm doing. So I actually think that most good pioneers just long for that support and accountability, and to be that sense of being part of something bigger.
And where that story is allowed to be told, whether it is in a traditional worship service in a church or in the denominational meeting or whatever, where these people who are prone to feeling misunderstood do feel cared for and understood.
Yeah, yeah.
Great. The next question I'm going to actually answer really quickly. Catherine asked, where does someone go about getting training? And actually, we've got a discount on our training that we're offering right now. So for people in the U.S., if you register today for Pioneer Communities, there's a $75 discount, and you can you can click the Register Now button on your screen to get that. You can also go to freshexpressionsus.org/pioneer-communities, and you can read up more about that. Real quick, Dave, do you know of a page on the website or anyone they can contact for specific info if they're in the UK?
Yeah, I mean, if they basically go onto the freshexpressions.org.uk site, that will give them, if they can't find that, I run a thing called the Centre for Pioneer Learning. If they Google that, they can contact me, and I can put them in touch with a local group. So here in the UK, we are more and more developing local networks of pioneers, both lay and ordained together. And then once a year, I'm involved in we run a national conference for pioneers, so people can come together. The advantage of being a small country is we can have a national conference, but it's just really exciting, I think, to come together, but also to hear what other people are doing and be excited by that and support and encourage, and also hear where stories are not so good, and to support and encourage those people as well.
And from our side, we will have this Pioneer Learning Community starting the end of February, so it's the last weekend of February, and it's sort of what we're calling flexible delivery, depending upon where participants are coming from. If you're coming in teams of 2s or 3s from an area of the country where we can travel easily, we'll come to you for some individualized coaching. But if you're coming from far away, we'll figure out how to do that via phone, via Skype, to provide you a year of training and coaching along the way, and then we'll have a concluding retreat where hopefully we'll share some stories of people actually beginning these fresh expressions of church. So again, the learning community that we're advertising today starts with a retreat in Richmond, Virginia, the last weekend of February. But we also can accommodate one day of rounds based on our ability to resource and the interest of various denominational groups and tribes and streams out where you are.
Brilliant.
Great. All right. Kirk asked, what do you do? How do you develop second-generation pioneers? And what he's talking about is they have a church that was started by somebody probably much like Dave, also much about the same age as Dave.
Yeah.
And now you've got kids who grew up in that church or people who came to that church down the road. And how do you inspire them to think of themselves as pioneers?
Yeah, great question. I think that, I mean, my advice would have been actually that right at the beginning they were thinking about that, so that as soon as you pioneered things, you're thinking, who are the next generation of pioneers? And we often use the language here of sustainability. What's going to make this sustainable in the future? And I think it is about investing in some of these people that you identify as pioneers and encouraging them to then pioneer from that. And I think you've got to build that into the DNA from the beginning, that this isn't the end of a process, but this is, in a sense, the beginning of the next part of this story. So that would be the thing I would say if you're starting something new. If it's gone on for a bit, I think you've got to go back to the story and say, what was the story that began this the first time, and how might this enable us to go again with this, and who might be the people we identify to do that. I've always found that it's important to go back to the kind of original story and say, what is that saying to us today, and how do we keep that fresh for us? I mean, the term fresh expression in that way is great. How do we freshly express that story for this community today?
Great. You got time for a couple more questions, Dave?
I have, yeah. I even hear my son apparently is listening in on this, so hello to him.
He actually said, "Killing it, Dad." Thanks, Callum, for.
Thanks, Callum.
Hi, Callum.
This is a great question. Dave could, and Gannon, you can pipe in if you got a good story. asking, this is Steve from California, asking if you can share a story about something that didn't work, something that we tried to pioneer and didn't work, and maybe just share what you got from that experience.
Are you talking about me or someone in general?
Well, I'll let you decide that.
Okay.
If you have a personal story.
Steve, one of my great passions in life is sport, and I've always thought that kind of sport's a great vehicle for the gospel, and a number of us started a kind of what we called a sports church here in Cambridge, and we began it on a Monday night, and we ran it for 2 years before we closed it, and the thing that made us close it was that we couldn't stop Christians trying to join us. And we realized that partly because we were on a Monday night, so they could go to their church and then still come to us, and they loved the things that we do. But that wasn't why we started it. This wasn't for bored Christians who wanted something a bit more entertaining. So we stopped it. And I'm hoping that one day we'll pick it up again and run with it. And I'm kind of looking for ways to do that. But in one sense, that it didn't work. We decided this isn't going to keep going and going. And I think that's one of the things with Pioneers, is that ability to say, hey, this isn't working, let's stop it and try something else. And one or two of the other leaders have gone on to do other things as well, pioneer other things. So I think the great thing for me is nothing of this is wasted, because you're just learning the whole time, and then you're reapplying that to new situations. But I've talked to venture capitalists, and I've asked them how much of the stuff that you invest in works, and they tell me that it's pretty small in terms of really working. But we have a kind of expectation that everything we try will work. And I think the word isn't failure, the word is prototype. We are trying prototypes to see, and this is about seeing where God is leading us. And the prototype's not going to be the finished thing, but it's going to lead us to that next step and the next step. So I'm a great believer in experimentation, and I think Pioneers classically, and I say this very much myself, I'd rather try it and it not work than always think, well, I wonder what would have happened if we tried this. And I think that's often at the heart of pioneering.
And I think we have to make sure that we're meeting a felt need of someone else. We've seen a recent example here in the States, and this is a wonderful ministry. We've got some women doing a street walking ministry. They walk the streets. I mean, I'm talking women in their 70s, walk at midnight, 2 in the morning. Praying for people on the streets, meeting a lot of women who are used in prostitution and are trying to get out. And they thought, well, they've been able to help some of them out. They've gotten to know hotel owners and that sort of thing. And they thought, well, what if we started some sort of fresh expression of church for these women? And so they began hosting a little get together in a fast food restaurant. And they were curious is that they'd always have someone come, but they'd never have more than one come at a time. Well, over time they realized, well, all these women are in competition with one another. They're not in relationship. They don't want to be in relationship, and so that's not a need that they have. And so they're still street walking. They're still praying. They're praying for healing. Wonderful things are happening, but it's probably not the community that's going to come around and create community together just because of their circumstance. So, but again, kudos to them for trying and keeping it going in another way.
Great. Well, looks like we've actually gotten through all the questions in the chat box. Gannon, do you want to just talk real quick one more time describing the upcoming Pioneer communities?
Sure. So quickly, at the end of February, this February 27th to March 1st, we have a Pioneer Learning Community Retreat where all the folks from wherever will gather. We'll share stories. We'll have some time of really training, developing, praying about what does it mean to listen to the Spirit, listen to God. Where might God be calling us? What kind of tools might we need to embark upon this journey together? And then it'll be over the course of a year. We'll, again, have some sort of customized coaching based upon need, based upon who we have signed up on the course. And then we'll come